Hello, welcome to the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest and this main stage event, Rethinking Creation for the Age of Climate Crisis, a conversation with Rabbi Dr. Arthur Greene and Dr. Stephanie Kaza. I'm Rabbi Josh Weisman, festival co-founder and senior Jewish educator at Hillel UW in Seattle. A note about accessibility for this event, you can select closed caption live transcript in the box at the lower edge of your screen, if that will help you access our event better. I want to mention that this is a great day for the festival to start. Major news out of the new administration today with the signing of executive orders on climate change led the president of the League of Conservation Voters to say about today, quote, "This is the single biggest day for climate action in more than a decade." And this particular conversation is very important to the festival's larger goals of animating us with inspiration and nourishment from tradition, unifying us within the Jewish community to give climate change a central place on the Jewish moral agenda, and uniting us with other traditions to confront the collective task ahead. I also want to acknowledge that today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and to offer that at the same time as we preserve the historical uniqueness of the memory of the Shoah, we also recognize that climate change threatens millions of human lives and can be included in the imperative of never again. So we're honored today to be joined by Rabbi Dr. Arthur Greene, one of the world's leading scholars of Jewish mysticism and Hasidism, and Dr. Stephanie Kaza, Professor Emerita at the University of Vermont, and a leading scholar of Buddhism and ecology. More on each of them before they speak. So we'll begin in a minute with Dr. Greene's presentation of his latest thinking on how creation must be reimagined to help us, to enable us to confront an era in which human life and the world themselves are threatened. After that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kaza to present in response from her own framework as a scholar of Buddhism and ecology. After that, I'll pose a couple of questions from you, the audience, and then the two presenters will discuss. Questions can be submitted in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, not through chat, but through the Q&A function, and I'll select some when they're both done presenting. Obviously, there are a lot of people here tonight. I won't get to all of your questions, unfortunately, but we'll do my best to summarize. I'm really looking forward to this as a rich exploration of Jewish and Buddhist thought on this most pressing crisis of our time. And my hope is that this will be a model for interfaith discussion and sharing as we confront climate change together. Now to our first presenter. Rabbi Dr. Arthur Greene is the founding dean and is currently rector of the Rabbinical School at Hebrew College. He's both a historian of Jewish religion and a theologian, and his work seems to form a bridge between those two. He's the author of over a dozen books, including, it seems, a new one every few months these days. And I must add on a personal note that Art is a dear teacher and mentor of mine who, during my years learning with him in rabbinical school, would periodically remind me and my classmates that whether we liked it or not, whether we were interested in it or not, climate change would be a defining feature of our rabbinates. That has proved to be true. Art, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. Wonderful to be with you and to be with all of you tonight. My friends, it is very late. If the great majority of climate scientists are to be believed, and I'm among the believers, the next several decades will be crucial in determining the ability of all higher forms of life, including the human, to survive and thrive on this beloved and much abused planet of ours. The gross irresponsibility and cynicism of governments, of business leaders, but really of all of us overconsumers, us overeaters and overheaters and overcoolers and overdrivers and overflyers. You know, the Hebrew word over means to transgress. When we transgress. All of this knowingly sacrificing long-range sustainability for short-term profit or convenience. This has led us to a moment of crisis we must confront with rigorous honesty, with nerves of steel, and with boundless compassion at the same time. Within the human community that collectively stands before this moment, a large portion of us consider ourselves to be religious people, in the broadest sense of that term. That means we subscribe to one or another form of religia, sets of rules about how to live the good life, rooted in the wisdom of one or another of our ancient traditions. I believe that we collectively, we religious folk, have a major role to play in this moment, and that's really the subject of my remarks today. To be a religious person means to perceive that we live in a world suffused with divinity, and we choose to act in response to that awareness. Some of us call that the power of the maker within the made. Some of us call out the whole earth is filled with God's glory. Some choose not to give it words at all, but to stand before it in wonder-struck silence. It makes little difference which formula we choose. It is the consciousness of the awesome presence of something infinitely greater than ourselves that binds us together, making us into a universal community of the faithful. Most of those who call themselves religious, however, become over-involved in proclaiming the uniqueness of their own particular sacred stories. Moses ascended to Mount Sinai and received the Torah. Jesus rose from the dead and conquered death. The moment of the Buddha's enlightenment has transformed the world forever. Muhammad became the chosen messenger of God whom all must follow. But there is a bigger story, infinitely bigger, and one that we all share. How did we get here, we humans, and where are we going? As a religious person, I believe that the evolution of species is the greatest sacred drama of all time. It is a tale, indeed it is the tale, in which the divine longs to be discovered, waits for us to discover it. It dwarfs all the other narratives, memories, and images that so preoccupy the mind of religions, including our own. To be a religious person in the 21st century means to accept the account of planetary origins provided by the astrophysicist, of life's origins by the biochemist, and of the emergence of species by the evolutionary biologist, but to see them all as reflecting a sacred process, in our language describable as the self-manifestation of Yod-He Vav-He, of that which I will pronounce Havaya, the one whose very name is the dynamic rendition of being itself, in every form of existence. The linking of the old and new accounts of creation is an essential task of contemporary religion. How do we embrace the scientific narrative without losing the essential value and the great spiritual power of God said, let there be? Each Friday night I raise my cup of wine and proclaim, on the seventh day God completed the work that he had made, resting on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, for in it he had rested from all the work God had created to be done. That moment is the highlight of my week. It is the most personally significant ritual act in which I engage as a Jew. But what is my relationship to that text that I so fervently call out? It is one of love and commitment, a feeling that the text is as filled to brim with meaning as my cup is filled with wine. It is a statement of my faith in divine creation, my gratitude for the gift of perceiving a sacred presence that underlies all that is. But it certainly could not be called belief in the Torah's creation story in any literal sense. I understand this planet is something like 4.5 billion years old, that it came to be as a result of a great stellar explosion that took place several billion years before that. I also understand that seas and dry land and trees and grasses and plants, the birds, the fish, the animals, and the creeping things, all described as created on one or another days of creation that preceded that first Sabbath, evolved over the course of a long and complex bioevolutionary process, running across thousands of centuries, rather than being declared into existence all within a week, however that week is conceived. Yet the story of creation and the weekly repetition of it is vital to my religious life. Nothing is more important to me than my non-literalist faith that we live in a created world. I believe that awareness of creation must be placed front and center in the religious language of the 21st century. This has everything to do with the environmental agenda and the key role religion needs to play in changing our attitudes toward the world in which we humans live. Without such a change, we will wantonly destroy ourselves, as is becoming more evident in headlines from day to day. It is also clear to me that the world's religions, as the source and preservers of the myths by which most people live, but also as the great guardians of humanity's moral conscience, need to step up and become deeply involved in this process of change. The Jewish mystical tradition in which I stand reviews creation as an ongoing process, constant rather than a single moment. Havaya, the source of being, renews constantly each day the act of creation, we say each morning in our daily prayers. The magnitude of both space and time, worlds without end, is well recognized within this tradition, as within others. Each of us creatures lives for but the blink of an eye within evolutionary time. How do we respond to that truth? What do we do with it? The task of theology today, I believe, is one of reframing the accounts of creation and natural history offered by the scientific consensus, helping us to view them in a different way, one that may guide us toward a more profound appreciation of that same reality, and indeed inspire us to help preserve it. The tale of life's origins and development, including its essential building block of natural selection, is well known to us moderns. But what would it mean to recount that tale with our with our eyes truly open, to see it with the eyes of wonder? We would come to see the entire course of evolution, from the simplest life forms millions of years ago to the great complexity of the human brain, which we still barely understand, and proceeding onward into the unknown future as a meaningful process. That is how I understand God said and there was, or even God looked into Torah and created the world. The process by which the world came to be is ultimately a decipherable and meaningful one. It can be translated from the realm of transcendent mystery into that of words, the linguistic symbols we need in order to wrap our minds around it. There is a one that is ever revealing itself to us within and behind the great diversity of life. That one is Havaya, being itself, the constant and the endlessly changing evolutionary parade. Viewed from our end of that process, the search that leads to discovery of that one is our human quest for knowledge and meaning, embracing both scientific advance and religious interpretation. But turned around, seen from the perspective of the constantly evolving energy itself, evolution can be seen as a process of ongoing revelation and self-disclosure. We discover, it reveals. It reveals, we discover. As the human mind advances from our point of view, understanding more of the structure, process, and history of the ever-evolving one, we are being given, from its point of view, ever greater insight into who we are, how we got here, and where we're going. The one has entered into this dance that we call evolution in order to make itself manifest. Begin l'ishtmoda'ah in the Zohar's language, to become, in order to become known. It extends itself into endless varieties of being, moving, though not consistently, from the simple toward the complex, all emerging from the single self-manifesting energy. If human language were adequate to this, we would say that it wants or seeks to make itself known in all these multiple ways. Here on this smallish planet in the middle of an otherwise undistinguished galaxy, something so astonishing has taken place that it demands to be called by the biblical term miracle rather than the Greco-Roman term nature, even though they're both pointing to the exact same set of facts. The descendants of one-celled creatures grew and developed, emerged onto dry land, and learned survival skills. One small branch of those descendants within that great evolutionary tree developed language and thought, until a subset of them could reflect on the nature of this entire process and derive meaning from it. Does that make us humans the be-all and end-all of creation? Hardly. If our generation doesn't destroy this planet, which of course as a fit habitation for higher forms of life, which of course it may do, I imagine a being existing here some thousands of generations from now in the evolutionary process who will be about as proud of us as ancestors as we are of the rhesus monkey. But for now, the present is as far as we can see. What will it mean to retell the current story of creation? The true religious reading of our new narrative of origins will be to look at the same story science tells us, growing richer in detail with discoveries or revelations from day to day, but to do so as religious people. That entails appreciating its deep poetry, as well as responding to its demand on our moral behavior. The incredibly complex interplay of forces and the thick web of mutual dependency in our world is no less amazing than the long journey traversed from one-celled animals beneath the sea to the complexity of the human brain. The interrelationships between soil, plant, and insects, or between climate, foliage, and animal life, all leave us breathless as we begin to truly contemplate them. The emergence of both bees and blossoms and the relationship between them took place over millions of years, step by evolutionary step. How could that have happened? There is an endless ingenuity in this self-manifesting being, an endless stream of creativity, of which we are only the tiniest part. There's indeed something supernatural about existence, something entirely out of the ordinary, beyond any easy explanation. But we understand the supernatural to reside wholly within the natural. The process may be an entirely natural one, yet by no means is it to be taken for granted, passed over as though it were not filled with mystery. The difference is all in our perception. If we could learn to view our biohistory this way, the incredible grandeur of the evolutionary journey would unfold before us. We Jews revere the memory of one Nachshon ben Aminadav, this week's Torah reading as it just happens, the first person to step into the Sea of Reeds after Israel left Egypt. The sea did not split, the story goes, until he was up to his neck in water. But what courage! But what about the courage of the first creature ever to make the move in the opposite direction, emerging from sea onto dry land? Do we appreciate the magnificence of that moment? Or the first to fly, to take wing into the air? Or the moment, of course, each one of these is a long, slow process, not just a moment, but the point is the same. When animals were divided from plants, when one sort of being was able to take nourishment from the soil, while another was able to exist without it, developing a mechanism to feed on plant and then animal life. How is it all possible, with all of us descending from the same single-celled creatures? How would such a reframed tale of creation read? It would be a narrative of the great reaching out by the inner one that inhabits each of us and binds us all together. A constant stretching of Havaya in the endless adventure of the one garbing itself in the multicolored garment of diversity and variety. Each creature and each cell within it would be viewed as a part of this tale, as a part of this ongoing journey, a mini adventure within the infinitely complex narrative that embraces us all. The meaning of this adventure would remain quite mysterious, but with a glimmer of hope that somewhere in the distant future, we might figure it all out. The evolutionary movement forward would be seen as a striving toward complexity toward ever thicker and ever richer patterns of self-manifestation. To say it in another way, derived from Kabbalistic language, I'm depicting the entire course of evolution as the infinitely varied self-garbing of an endless energy flow. All being exists in an eternal dialectic of hitpashtut, the endless flowing forth of that single energy, and hitlabshut, the garbing of that energy in distinctive forms. But now we add, of course, an important post-Darwinian caveat. The only means it has is that of natural selection and its resulting patterns of change and growth. Hence the length and slowness of the journey. Precisely in this lies the utterly marvelous nature of what it means, step after step. To see that process with the eyes of wonder is the starting point of contemporary religious awareness. I've spent this time speaking to you about a theology of creation because I believe it is our best shared religious language throughout the three Western traditions for addressing the crisis in which we find ourselves. A big, bold Jewish climate festival is a great idea, but let us modestly remember that we are a tiny and alone inconsequential bit of humanity that must stand together with others in dealing with this hour. We need to make common cause with much larger religious communities, particularly that of Christendom, the dominant religious culture in which we live. Our shared biblical legacy is a bridge to that partnership. But all of us people of faith need each other, my friends, and the world needs us to realize how much we need each other. I'm especially glad Stephanie Kaza is here tonight to be with us, responding from a perspective other than the Jewish Judeo-Christian tradition. We have to show that we can all stand together in awareness of the miraculous nature of our existence. We need to find a shared language that will give expression to the sense that divinity penetrates every moment of our lives, enlightening even their darkest corners. We need together to form the core of a new resistance to the brutalization of life in our time, to the meaningless secularization, the disregard for the sacred quality of each human life, and the created world of which we are a part. In the continuing great strength of religion as a factor in human affairs, perhaps surprising to some in our era, unpredictable a century ago, I would say, we've been given a great gift, a salvific opportunity we cannot allow to slip between our fingers. Will the resurgence of faith or rebirth of spiritual awareness bring about the deliverance so urgently needed by our planet? Needless to say, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. We've seen Buddhists slaughtering Muslims in Myanmar recently and Muslims slaughtering Christians and Yazidis on the battlefields of Syria. But it was not so long ago we heard of Christians slaughtering Muslims in refugee camps in Lebanon, and of a certain Jew cheered on by others who did the same to Palestinian Muslims, desecrating the holy grave of our shared ancestors. All this hate and slaughter keeps all these so-called religious folk too busy to confront the most serious challenge of our age, the environmental crisis that threatens to overwhelm us all. But there is also a good and possibly, but is there also a good, I'm not sure, and possibly even salvific side to this new power of religion? One that might lead us all to face it together rather than ignoring that challenge? When religions act separately and competitively, they're responsible for some of the worst atrocities that happen on our planet. When religions act together in concert, they usually do so for the good. How do we bring such a committed and shared religiosity to birth? Let me ask the question a different way. Is it coincidence that the first species on Earth to have the ability to destroy our biosphere as a fit habit for life is also the first to be equipped with a moral conscience and perspective that might prevent us from doing so? Religions, despite all their limitations and narrowness, serve humanity as the great vehicle for that moral conscience. Might it be that the rebirth of religion is emerging from a divine call that's welling up within us, stirring us to repent of our collective sins, collective abuse of the planet and of one another before it is too late? Is God seeking to protect that last shred of moral conscience in humanity? Is religion itself being given the gift of this awareness and power to stir conscience by the one it worships in order to awaken humanity to its dangerous self-serving slumber as the earth is pillaged? Or if you're more comfortable with Gaian than with biblical language, might you say that Mother Earth is offering us renewed access to the sacred in our times, as her need increases and becomes more desperate, so as to arouse even the most avowedly secular among us to come to her defense? I conclude with a bit of religious praxis. Several years ago, the students and faculty of our rabbinical school at Hebrew College, at my urging, took on an old new practice as part of our daily prayers. The practice is called Ma'amad, and it dates from the Second Temple times, the era when both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism were born. The rites in our Jerusalem temple were performed by members of the priestly tribe from around the countryside who came up to Jerusalem for 2-week shifts. While they were on call, their neighbors at home would support them by each day reciting the verse from Genesis 1, narrating the creation of that day. On Sundays, they would say, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." On Mondays, God said, "Let there be a firmament," and so on. In renewing this practice, we complete the cycle of creation each Shabbat with heaven and earth were finished. I urge all those who hear us, Jews, Christians, and others, whether you already have a daily prayer practice or not, to consider joining with us in this community of prayer for our world and in spreading this old new tradition. It is meant, of course, as a daily reminder of the sacred presence that fills our world, and is meant as a call to action. It is indeed very late. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here with us.
And thank you, Art. Urgent words. It is indeed very late. And here we are, coming together as a Jewish community and in dialogue with other faiths, as you said, for when religions come together, usually it is for the good. And may that be so tonight, as I introduce our next speaker, Dr. Stephanie Kaza, Professor Emerita of Environmental Studies at the University of Vermont, and a Soto Zen practitioner. Some of the titles of her books will give you a flavor of the kind of work that she does, which is very exciting. They include Green Buddhism, Practice and Compassionate Action in Uncertain Times. Hooked, Buddhist Writings on Greed, Desire, and the Urge to Consume. And Conversations with Trees, an Intimate Ecology. She also co-edited with Kenneth Kraft, Dharma Reign, Sources of Buddhist Environmentalism, and recently edited the tribute volume, A Wild Love for the World, Joanna Macy and the Work of Our Time. Dr. Kaza, we're very much looking forward to hearing your reflections this evening.
Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you to the entire festival for inviting me and having here being part of really quite a wonderful cornucopia of information, of inspiration, and of true motivation for the work we need to do ahead. So let me share with you tonight a little bit of some Buddhist perspectives, and then I really look forward to my conversation with Dr. Greene. So we're committed together to this idea that if we are both thinking about climate change across religions, we're much more likely to come up with creative ideas and also have a lot more fun, I must say. So we might use the word in Buddhism of koan, the koan of climate change. As you're all well aware, it's not just that there's melting ice and bleaching coral reefs and more fires and floods, but a complexity of feedback that we don't entirely understand. And this feedback is going to generate even more unexpected impacts and irreversible changes, and will call for us as human beings to figure out how to be part of that feedback and change some of the directions we're heading. Religions have always responded to human suffering, and now we are certainly seeing increased climate-related disasters calling for that kind of help. Fire, flood, and all of the things we're seeing from year to year. I'm calling this our common challenge, our planetary common challenge. And when we look at it from a global perspective, we have to see that it's not just environmental or climate, but at the same time, we're looking at economic insecurity, unstable markets, certainly also toxins around the world affecting human health as well as ecological health, the pandemic we cannot ignore, and our own sense of overwhelm, very often just too much information. And then, as we see right now, often feeling isolated in our fears and concerns, needing ways to express them, sort them out, share them with people of other faith perspectives. So we can have not too much religious leadership and all that we can get from all the various practice places through such examples as the interfaith power and light. So let me look at a few of the many Buddhist teachings that I think overlap well with the Judeo-Christian Muslim traditions and places where we can share some common action and motivation. So the three I'm highlighting here are the central law of interdependence, which Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing, and practices that will strengthen our intention and our compassion. And then I want to include a lot on ethics, because I think the ethical and moral traditions of our world faith practices are a golden treasure for us to draw on in working with climate change. So the idea that our ethics are based in interbeing is foundational for all Buddhist perspectives. This is another word for the great font of energy that Dr. Greene described. Sometimes in Buddhism, we emphasize the co-arising aspect of that one thing arises because of another, and that there's multiple causes and effects constantly shaping each other. We see this right now in climate change particularly. But an important aspect is what is emerging, always keeping your eye on not just what is passing away, but what new forms of life, of technology, of human sharing are arising. So a sense that the universe is continually unfolding, and also very much that human beings are in this web of life. You cannot fall out of it, and we each have agency. So this is one of my favorite banners of all times. The whole earth is my true body, a Buddhist Peace Fellowship banner in one of the climate marches. To practice with this principle of interbeing, perhaps the practice that has gained the most attention in the last decade is the practice of mindfulness, brought to us by the Vietnamese Zen teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. And he sees this as medicine for the suffering of the world. But it's also capacity building. It's a way to mitigate directly the ever increasing chaos of the world with calmness, while at the same time not turning away. And as he says, the most precious gift we can offer others is our presence. So this very practice of building capacity and calmness is something we can invest our time in, our prayers in, our meditations in. This will naturally generate a sense of compassion. From the perspective of interbeing, one automatically feels a sense of caring for others because you see them as yourself, as being co-created, co-emerging, co-arising with one's own self, own ideas, own health. So the 5 Buddhist ethical precepts that are core to everything begin with not harming life. That's a tall order, and it often means a lot of trade-offs, but it's a powerful moral compass. Not taking what is not given, not stealing as we have for so long from the environment, from our climate, and not participating in abusive relations. Traditionally, this meant not misusing sexuality, But in modern environmental terms, it means not abusing relationships with trees, with mushrooms, with insects, with the climate, with all of it. And not speaking falsely. Lying, misrepresentation does not help us get any closer to dealing with the complexities that face us. And then not using intoxicating substances or behaviors. And this is so we won't be deluded. We won't waste any of our precious mental and heart capacity in being deluded and distracted. So I believe strongly that religions are called to consider their ethical obligation in the context of climate change. And this is what Buddhists would bring to the table. So let's look quickly at non-harming. It's just really what it sounds like, but in effect, it's a commitment to foster contentment and reduce craving. It's the craving that leads us into realms of harm that we never thought we would enter. It will also guide us towards developing infrastructures of well-being, community levels, at city levels and neighborhoods, at our state and national and global levels. It also means a commitment to passing this on intergenerationally. We cannot do interfaith work unless we do it across generations. So we build in a kind of legacy and a stream of thought and caring that goes from one generation to the next. Religious institutions are perfectly poised to do exactly this with their religious education programs, so that they, by example, can support sustainable behavior and earth care as actual spiritual practice. This means always ethics are practices of restraint. So we can then name the things that we can choose restraint around. Climate impacts are generated very much from our lifestyle choices, from how much we love, as Dr. Greene said, overflying and over mobility of all kinds, and our love of technological speed and entertainment, and certainly our consumption of all sorts of products and food, etc. They all have some degree of climate impact. So looking directly at those desires and then choosing practice arenas for reducing consumption can be an ethical commitment we can make across religions. Now, Buddhists have long had a kind of perspective of time that goes beyond the eons through the thinking of things in karmic terms. I like the phrase deep time, and that's something supported quite a bit by one of my important mentors, Joanna Macy. But I'm also trained in natural history, and the geologists are quite good at deep time, and something even a new geologist is calling timefulness practice, correcting for our time illiteracy. This is another way of saying understanding the creation story across the millennia and shifting our perception by understanding the long scales of climate time. This then will give us a much more accurate understanding of where human life belongs in the scale of time. And ethics based on this kind of long view cultivate in our human heart some very important capacities that will take us through these challenges of climate change, starting, of course, with humility, the proper sense of scale, and along the way, giving us a sense of patience. These changes won't all be made in our individual lifetimes. We have to take the long view with that long view perspective. And we're getting a taste right now of what that means with the pandemic, of how we endure, how we stand strong and with stability, even through these many climate disasters and many climate questions that we don't have all the answers for. And also how we stand strong as our religious institutions and faiths catch up to these very important questions of our time. The capacity of equanimity has been really highlighted by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And just recently, I watched a wonderful seminar with him and Greta Thunberg, the Swedish young environmental activist, and they were focusing on feedback loops. This was sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute. We've seen over so many decades the Dalai Lama offering his very being as an example of equanimity, that it is possible to take account of and interact with the suffering of the world and still be effective in what your actions are. It's possible to gain capacity in staying centered even while climatic conditions are changing. And it is possible to use that equanimity and stability arising from spiritual practice as a way to prepare for climate impacts, which inevitably will affect social support systems. So as the Dalai Lama says, because we all share this planet Earth, we have to live in harmony and peace with each other and with nature. This is not just a dream, but a necessity. So much like Pope Francis has put forth a manifesto for climate change, the Dalai Lama's manifesto on climate change has just come out recently. And I think it's wonderfully encouraging that these two global leaders of Christianity and Buddhism are saying the same things. They are saying that it's time for us to become one common humanity, to see ourselves as planet people. So I take that as the foundation for our common challenge and our ongoing conversation. We have to find ways to build interreligious dialogue and commitment, name them, enact them, offer invitations to them like this one, and then see which of our religious stories and practices and examples will be most helpful, what we call in Buddhism, skillful means. And then we find ways for partnerships, for building that joy of working together that breaks through isolation, that conquers fear, that makes this part of our evolutionary journey something we are doing together across our differences. And that is all because of our motivation to have outcomes that make a difference. So there's no question in my mind that thoughtful action and reflection are needed in every single one of the religious traditions. There's no time to waste. And we need the leadership, I will say, of the key voices and of the large institutions, as they are trendsetters, so others will follow. So I just give as an example my own joy when I was invited by my home temple, the San Francisco Zen Center, to do a training for the 3 temples that are part of that, Tassajara, Green Gulch, and San Francisco, with all of their senior staff and senior priests. And to take some of these slides and many more to educate them about the role of climate and to offer possible practices, sermon ideas, simple things and complicated things that can be done at those temples. And now those ideas have gone out to all the affiliate temples to that particular Zen center across the country. So I know this is possible, but there's a lot we can do, a lot of catching up to do. And I myself hope to do much more of this interreligious dialogue, I think because it's so much fun. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can have some questions and conversation with our host and also with our lead presenter, Dr. Greene. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Kaza. Feel so really filled up with both of your presentation of just a wealth of material that is inspirational and hope-giving and in some senses practical. And I want to begin with that question of practicality and then turn to some of the audience questions. You both shared resources from your respective traditions. And the question that occurs to me after hearing them both side by side is, how do we use each other's resources, as it were? We've heard resources from Judaism, resources from Buddhism. Is it appropriate? And if so, how can Jewish people take what seems effective on a spiritual or practical level and employ it? And conversely, how can people following Buddhist traditions, or really any traditions, take from the Jewish realm of thought and practice and ethics and appropriately and effectively use that to strengthen our climate work? Would be interested to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I would say that much of the Jewish community in this country lives so much in the world of middle-class comfort, of a sort of bourgeois value system, that it has adapted to Judaism, or that it has used Judaism as a cover for some of the resources that Buddhism has about training us to let go of possessions, let go of neediness, let go of this drunken attraction Jewish community seems to have to success and high achievement. That's our drug of choice: success and high achievement. And to be able to take our religious traditions, our own spiritual tradition, but also some of the meditational values and detachment values we're learning from our contact with the religions of the East, which is brand new for us, let's remember. That of course reinforces some of the best elements in our own tradition. That sense of equanimity is an old Jewish value, hishtavut, and disentanglement from desire is something that we could stand a very heavy dose of in our community.
Well, I very much like the Buddhist concept of Kalyana Mitra, which is spiritual friendship. And I think the more Buddhists have Jewish friends and learn and appreciate some of the aspects of Jewish practice and the history and the groundedness of the Judaic system and religion, I think that can help. In the Western world, Buddhists are still newbies in so many ways. They're all excited about mindfulness or reading scriptures, but it's not a religion that's grounded in place and geography in the West. It will take many hundreds of years for that to be true. And so we can look to Judaism for the groundedness and well worked out scriptures and rituals of the holidays, which I personally am a big fan of Tu B'Shavat, the big holiday of this weekend, partly because of the emphasis on trees. I even tried as a non-Jew to teach this in my religion and ecology class. But I really enjoy knowing and pacing the monthly rhythms of the High Holy Days and Sukkot and various ones. So the Buddhist holidays are not necessarily so tied to seasons, though the regular monthly celebrations of avowal are tied to the full moon. And at least in the Zen tradition, this is a good chance to look back over the month about really where have you been transgressing, and then a kind of self-forgiveness, a realization. So, but we need each other's help through spiritual friendship. So I think more Jewish and Buddhist leaders and teachers working together with each other and doing that in front of their congregations in a way that is a public kind of validation for this kind of interreligious dialogue. And that will help others in their neighborhoods and on their blocks have smaller micro conversations like that.
Great. I want to pick up on that theme of spiritual friendship, which is so basic to Judaism as I understand it. I've been involved in a movement called Chavurah for the last half century, sort of creating small fellowship groups of people who really share a sense of spiritual direction and supporting one another in their own personal spiritual growth. And to think about using that notion of Chavurah, that notion of intimate community and fellowship for people who are concerned with issues of environment and planetary survival, whether it's within the Jewish community or maybe doing it cross-traditionally, to take the notion of Chavurah and try to get small groups of people who are close to one another to work together on environmental process and on raising awareness. I think it'd be a very powerful tool. That what you had a term interbeing, which is a new term for me. Interbeing is very nice, and that goes with that sense of of creating intimate spiritual communities that then band together. I think congregations can sometimes be too big and too impersonal, and to have small networks of spiritual friends is a very important building block of this awareness we're seeking.
I'd like to add to that just one other thing, which is with that kind of support, religious groups may feel much more emboldened to try to influence local policy. And I know I do a little interreligious dialogue with the Unitarian Church, where I'm also a member, and I'm very impressed with how often they want to sign on to various interreligious positions that are in trying to stop fossil fuel infrastructure projects, for example. And I think it makes a real difference when people of faith, but particularly institutions of faith, stand up and take positions around concerns for climate.
Wow. And I think we're actually seeing a great example of that spiritual friendship or interfaith chavurah that you're both talking about begin right now. So let this be the beginning of more flowering of both those things. Really loving this dialogue already. And also would like to note that I think, if I could add something that I think is an area of commonality between Judaism and Buddhism that is really relevant to this discussion, is restraint, which Dr. Kaza talked about. Art, that wasn't the focus of your remarks, but obviously practices like Shabbat include a fair amount of restraint. Kashrut, the Jewish eating practices, obviously involve restraint, and those, that may be an area of a certain amount of overlap that the broader society could learn from both of us. I also want to observe what may be an area of difference, perhaps, and then explore it more deeply, because we may see that it's not as different as it seems at the beginning, or there are some productive differences. Art began and ended his remarks by saying it is very late. In other words, with a note of urgency. And Dr. Kaza, in your remarks, you talked about a Buddhist notion of deep time, which seems to be a less urgent notion of time. And I'm seeing in our questions from the audience a similar tension, where one questioner notes that politics often centers on short-term election cycles, and how can religion shift our thinking towards a long-term focus needed for climate change on the one hand, and another question about how can Judaism and religion speak to the scale and timeline of the climate threat and responding to it, which I take as a note of urgency. So urgency, the hour is late, deep time, long perspective. Would love to hear both of your thoughts about how, from your respective traditions, you hold both of those things, and what's the right way to hold those things in this moment of climate crisis.
Well, exactly, holding both, exactly. Neither one should contradict the other. Of course, there's an urgency, and that's what we're all about. And we gather so much in these days of great concern, because we see an almost irreversible sense that terrible human suffering and terrible suffering of other living creatures is going to be caused in the coming decades by the gross neglect and irresponsibility of the period immediately behind us. There's no question about it anymore. Seas are going to rise, and poor populations and populations that are in some ways the least responsible for climate change, places like Bangladesh and other very low altitude communities, sea level communities, are going to be destroyed or terribly harmed in decades to come. There is no question about that anymore. So there is terrible urgency. At the same time, yes, as I said, we live. Each of us lives for the blink of an eye in evolutionary time, and all of this period through which we're living is just a few instants in the history of this earth. And it may be that we will go through another ice age and another great age of destruction, and something new and different will emerge. Maybe we are destined to give way to other forms of life that will manage it better somehow. But we are invested, after all, in this project called humanity and called civilization and called our own extended human way of living. And I'm not one willing to give up on it. So I think we are very committed to its survival and its growth as we face both the immediate and the eternal.
I think this is a wonderful question, and I appreciate what you've offered to this, Dr. Greene. And I would like to point out that the Judeo-Christian traditions have a strongly prophetic aspect to them, which has been powerfully motivating. There's no question that somebody kind of shaking their hand and saying, this is important, wake up, is part of these religious traditions, and it works. When somebody's in the pulpit doing that, you should be shaking in your boots. That is less common in Buddhism. And Buddhism has been faulted for being somewhat passive about a kind of shrug, like, well, it'll all work out, the karma, blah, blah, blah. And that is a problem for Buddhism. Mm-hmm. So in fact, Buddhists in the West can benefit from this prophetic tradition and enjoy it. But we are probably in Buddhist traditions partly out of reactivity to it. So this is an interesting dynamic to look at. When things are so filled with urgency, we can have a kind of short-circuiting of anxiety. The urgency just paralyzes us. Mm-hmm. So we can, as Buddhists, want to retreat into our little sitting cushions, and that is also not really acceptable. The urgency means that it's not okay for Buddhism in the West to translate into escapism. It has to translate also into action. And so I know I belong to an engaged Buddhist Sangha, but for a long time, engaged Buddhism has been seen as an offshoot or a small little part of Buddhism. And I think that is changing right now with the pandemic and with the climate crisis. The more Buddhist voices that act in a prophetic way and borrow some of this rhetoric from the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think it will be helpful. And at the same time, the more we practice equanimity and stability, the more able we will be to be present for these big concerns and not lose our energy to paralysis or anxiety or grief or despair. We must have enough presence of mind to understand how those work and still listen to the call.
I just want to add a word about the pandemic. It's been so nice to spend an hour not thinking about the pandemic. But I want to say that I find, we have a line in our prayers: bless this year, give us the blessing of this year. And I've thought a lot about this seemingly very cursed year we lived through. What's the blessing in it? And Barech Aleinu Shana Hazot, bless this year for us. And I think there is some blessing in that we have seen the ability of a tremendous part of humanity to be able to change its behavior in serious ways in the face of crisis. There's a certain dress rehearsal quality about this year. When we think about the climate crisis that is to come, how will we react? Will we be able to change our behavior? Mm-hmm. And we spend a lot of time in this country being angry and being upset about the people who refuse to wear masks, who don't participate, and so on, and all that has led to, and I don't have to go down that path because you all know about it. But look at how many people, what a large percentage of the human race has put on masks, has socially distanced, has changed behavior. And because this is what we need in order to survive. What will that mean? How will that help us prepare for whatever the next round is that's coming about through climate change and climate crisis? And giving us a sense that sort of Obama's "yes we can" language has really gained a lot of emphasis, I think, in this period. And I think in that sense, the pandemic has been an important collective experience for us, maybe transformative.
Dr. Greene, I would add to that whether we wanted to or not, we've all become more grounded in our places. It's almost as if you were a teenager and somebody said, I'm sorry, you're grounded, you have to stay home. So I know I doubled the size of my garden, and then we ate many more heads of lettuce, locally, and people out taking walks. That to me is skillful means. They may not be Buddhists, but they are gaining a kind of equanimity by learning their neighborhood and seeing their neighbors, even from a distance, and walking in the streets because there aren't so many cars there. So this is, again, I think a silver lining of really keeping our feet on the ground. And we need that to be ready for what comes next.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you calling us into the present context. And perhaps for closing remarks, I'll invite each of you to share thoughts also about the current political context and what your spiritual traditions and resources bring to that moment. You just spoke beautifully to some silver linings, some hidden blessings, if you will, of the pandemic moment. And the timing of this festival is wonderful. As I mentioned in the beginning, we've had executive orders signed just today that make significant progress on climate change after years of not only neglect, but in fact, destructive backwards motion. We're entering, it seems, a new political context, and there will be sessions on that in the festival days to come. In a moment where there is perhaps more opportunity for us to take concrete collective action, what would you say as religious thinkers to your own communities and to religious people throughout, let's say, the United States, if not the world, about how we act and hold ourselves in this moment of perhaps opportunity?
Well, I would say we prayerfully support our leadership. First of all, this new leadership, there's a breath of fresh air in this country on this issue and so many others that has taken place in the past week. We no longer turn on the news so many times a day to see what the latest calamity coming out of the White House or coming out of Washington is. We actually see good things happen and progress made, and it's a long road ahead. I think passing the right kind of legislation in Congress will not be easy because of the very narrow split between the two parties, and the interests of the fossil fuel industry and so on are still very strong. So I think we've got a long road to go on the national sense, but I think we all have to become aware and supportive of progressive legislation, because legislation will make a very big difference when you ask about the political sphere. In terms of what we do, I would say support for local preservation efforts, for local natural reserves are very important. In Massachusetts, we have a wonderful organization called the Trustees of Reservations, of which I'm a member. I get their literature, and it's visiting a place within 10 or 20 miles of your home that has a beautiful forest or a modestly beautiful places. I think we've learned that it's not so wise for us all to get on airplanes and go to Yellowstone or go to Yosemite from across the country. The idea that we go to seek natural beauty at great distances, all that travel costs an awful lot in terms of carbon footprint. So thinking more locally about preserving beauty and preserving nature and getting involved in the kind of local efforts that you have, I think is terribly important. And Josh, you and I are both very committed to planting trees. Let's say a word for trees on Tu B'Shvat. This is the new year of the trees. And this holiday was recreated in some ways almost a century ago by early Zionist leaders who said, plant a tree in Israel. This is the day of planting trees. And now we've tried to universalize that and say, we need trees to reforest the world. And so getting involved in efforts to reforest this earth as it is being so drastically deforested, both by the terrible fires you're having on the West Coast, but by the awful actions being undertaken in Brazil and other places of clearing rainforest. So commitment to human beings and trees being partners in this world and supporting reforestation, I think is really the call of this particular day, and I want it to be heard.
Absolutely. And we'll end on a note of action. Dr. Kaza, would love to hear your thoughts on the current moment in terms of opportunity from your tradition.
Well, I also, of course, come from the field of environmental studies, so I'm looking at Buddhism through that lens. And it's clear that the three biggest areas in which taking action will make a difference is energy and energy use, transportation, mobility, and food. So these practices of restraint that Dr. Greene mentioned, I think can be raised in every Buddhist center. Many are vegetarian, some are being pressured to be vegan. And I would listen to the youngest generations. The food revolution is going faster than at any other age group. They really see the suffering and really don't want to be part of it. As for transportation, I would add to that sense of taking care of your local place. In Portland, people are clamoring to take back the streets and put little, picnic tables next to the restaurants and open up more streets, take them back from cars. We don't need as many of the streets as we've gotten. So creating places of conviviality and of social contact, even now, even when we need to be somewhat physically distanced, we can still socialize. And the third arena about energy, well, honestly, is there any reason for any temple or church in the country not to have solar panels on its roof? So right away, any religious institution can form a committee and get started on this. It will take, months and years. It took us that long at the First Unitarian Church to do the evaluation, bring the people in. But the way we did it was really touching to me, that all the members, they figured out the cost of it and then sold $1,000 shares in that investment. So it became a community investment, which eventually you would get that money back, I don't know, 10 years from now. But by buying into it, you bought into your church as an example of the new way we have to be thinking. So that, like planting trees, it's just such a no-brainer that we all should be leading the charge towards solar panels on our institutional roofs. So with that, I will leave you with this idea that that's all small b Buddhist actions. And one way that I pray for our leaders in Washington is that any of the small b Buddhists on their staffs and any of the Congress people who might be secretly meditating, that action be kind of augmented and amplified in those feedback loops by my prayers through thinking like a small b Buddhist.
From sublime religious thought and the depths of our tradition to the present day and some very concrete positive things that we can do in this moment. It's been a really wonderful conversation with both of you, Dr. Greene, Dr. Kaza, and a model, I think, of spiritual friendship or interfaith chavurah, and collective unification around this collective task that faces us. And with that note of action ringing in our ears, I want to share in the chat a few links that I would love for everyone to copy and paste. You won't have them after this call closes. We have a letter that you can sign, and we encourage you to. A simple call to the new president and Congress to take urgent, bold action on climate change in the first 100 days. And some personal commitments and some ways that you can get your community involved. So I encourage you to copy and paste those links and click through them following this call, because this Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest is very much about learning, and it's very much about taking action right now in a moment of opportunity to move the needle on climate change. So I want to thank Dr. Stephanie Kaza, Rabbi Dr. Art Greene. I was really enriched by this. We had 150 people who were really enriched by this conversation. I want to thank our tech staff and everyone who participated and submitted questions, and really encourage you to end the evening with a few simple action steps and to come back for more events in our Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest lineup in the 4 days to come. It's not over. Happy Tu B'Shvat, and thank you for joining us.